Hello, welcome to another episode of Transatlantic AI Conversations. I'm Kornbluh, Distinguished Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US. These are a series of conversations where we're trying to demystify AI and talk about how it can be harnessed for the public good. We are really delighted to have Anu Bradford here today. She's a professor of law and international organization at Columbia Law School. Her new book is being read everywhere. It's called Digital Empires Inside the Global Battle to Regulate Technology. And so she's just a perfect person to really talk to us about the global regulatory landscape and how it will impact AI and what else we need to do. So welcome, Anu.
Karen, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Would you just start out and give us an overview of the framework that you talk about in your book? I think there are three models that you lay out.
Yeah, so I start from this notion that there's increasingly now a global consensus that technology needs to be regulated, but there is no consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So I argue that there are three primary ways to think about the governance of technology, including AI. We have the American market-driven model, the Chinese state-driven model, and a European, what I call a rights-driven regulatory model. So all these models reflect different traditions, values, priorities, and just a view of what a digital society ought to look like. And I call all of these empires because none of the three regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each digital empire is actively exporting its respective regulatory model abroad, and in that process, also expanding its relative sphere of influence.
And what are the vertical battles that you talk about?
Yeah, so I argue that we are witnessing different types of battles at two different levels. So I talk about this horizontal battle, which is the battle between the empires themselves. So we have a US-China tech war. We have various regulatory battles between the US and the EU. But we also then have these vertical battles because at the same time, the empires are fighting one another. They are also engaged in these battles where they are seeking to rein in the tech companies in their own markets. So we also see the governments versus the tech companies that leads then to this question of who ultimately governs the digital economy. Is it the states that are still in charge, or is it actually the tech companies that are the most influential actors that are shaping the way technology is used and deployed and how digital societies have evolved and continue to evolve?
And how do you, one other question about the book, and then we'll delve into some recent developments. What are your thoughts when people say we're entering this new tech Cold War?
Yeah, so I certainly understand where that reference comes, including the use of the war in that sentence. So technology is seen increasingly through a lens of geopolitics. So new technologies like AI have both commercial and military applications. They are the instruments of economic power, of geopolitical power, even military power. And those battles become then particularly consequential for states. So that's why we see this race to develop AI and other powerful technologies where the state feels that their economic and their geopolitical destiny is shaped by who wins that race. So in that sense, I think the wording or the term of the Cold War in the context of tech is accurate because it is really capturing the stakes involved and the tensions involved and how much really the geopolitical reality and the tensions are shaping the conversations around technology.
And so the recent developments, since you wrote your book, the EU has finalized their AI Act, and the US, the Biden administration, has put out the AI executive order. How did that fit into your framework? And does that, I mean, I personally thought that the Biden administration's EO was a surprise in how detailed it was and how focused it was on solving very specific problems. I wonder if you think that change is a departure in a way from the market-driven model.
So in a way, yes. So in the book, I argue that the US is very focused on free markets, free speech, free internet, reluctant to intervene with regulation in order to preserve the benefits of innovative marketplace. And we have therefore seen a strong commitment to this techno-optimist, techno-libertarian worldview. And regulation just doesn't really fit into that worldview. Whereas the EU, with its rights-driven regulation, it was no surprise that the EU was again the first jurisdiction to go ahead with a binding, very ambitious, comprehensive AI Act. But it was interesting, and that's something that I was predicting in the book, that the US is increasingly now starting to rethink those techno-libertarian commitments. And it's starting to move closer to the EU's rights-driven regulatory model. So I think the conversation is shifting in the US. Public opinion is shifting. The Americans no longer trust the tech companies the same way. They want more regulation. We see our Congress that doesn't really agree on anything, agree on two things. So one is that China is a problem, and the second that the big tech is a problem. So we see now bipartisan attempt to overturn that long-held consensus that tech companies can be left to their own devices. And I think the conversation is particularly heated around the AI, where the benefits of AI are just exponential, they are enormous, but also the harms, the fears surrounding ungoverned AI are genuinely felt across the country. So I think the executive order on AI really encapsulates this shift that the US is now undergoing. It is no longer a market-driven manifesto. It really shows that there are genuine concerns and that the US feels that the government needs to step in and regulate. But that said, Karen, I think it is a long way from creating the kind of legal framework that the EU's AI Act is creating. It still has a lot of voluntary commitments, a lot of guidelines, a lot of studies that needs to be done, and ultimately imposes many fewer constraints on the developers of AI compared to the EU's AI Act. But the direction is definitely towards the EU and not the other way around.
And what do you say? There's a very, as you say, there's a strongly held feeling that we shouldn't leave the tech companies to themselves, but there's also a very strong feeling that you talked about that we don't want to restrain innovation, and that it's a real strength of America, and that regulation is opposed to innovation, and that government bureaucrats just will never keep up and they'll never get it right. And then if when American innovators look at Europe, they don't see a lot of tech giants the way we see here. And so that confirms that view. What is your response to that? Do you think that it's either or and that Europe has chosen regulation over innovation?
So I am rather concerned about the state of technological innovation in Europe. I think those observations are accurate. The US has a much better track record in creating notable tech companies. There are some exceptions. There's the ASML, the leader in the semiconductor equipment space. But those success stories are not at the level we see them in the US. And at the same time, even if people have a hard time naming it the European tech company, they all can name the GDPR. So the EU has become known for its inclination to regulate. But I do take an issue with this idea that the lack of European innovations in the tech space should somehow be attributed to its commitment to regulate technology and pursue the protection of fundamental rights. I don't think that is the correlation that we should be focusing on. It's not because of the GDPR, or it's not because now the AI Act that we don't see all these tech companies emanating from Europe. So I have argued that there are much more fundamental pillars of the tech ecosystem that exist in the US and that are missing in the EU, and that better explain why the innovations are really emerging from the US. So I highlight the absence of a digital single market in the EU. So there is still the fragmented market, which makes it very difficult for the tech companies to scale across that heterogeneous marketplace. Second, there is no robust, deep, integrated capital markets union in the EU. So it is much harder to fund your innovations in the EU. And when you compare that to the very robust venture capital market in the US, it is really a big gap between the two. And the third issue, Karen, is that it is very difficult to see the European tech entrepreneurs to engage in the kind of risk taking that is needed for technological innovations. So bankruptcy laws in Europe are punitive, often just really preventing a second chance for an entrepreneur that fails. But there's also a cultural attitude whereby the failure is not tolerated the same way. It's baked into the business model of the Silicon Valley. You try hard, you sometimes fail, and then you go and raise more money, and they give you more money because you clearly are working on hard things. And the fourth thing is that you cannot be the leading innovator unless you have access to the top innovators. And the US has been remarkably successful in hiring from the global talent base. So immigration is a really big part of the American story of innovation. Over 50% of our $1 billion startups have an immigrant founder in the US. And the Europeans just have not had the same commitment to diversity, the same commitment for pathways for immigration. And I think that is a big distinction between and has a lot of explanatory power in why many of the tech innovations come from the US and not from the EU. That has very little to do with the GDPR or the AI Act.
We could spend hours on each one of those. That's very, very interesting. Do you see progress being made or any convergence, any consensus building around making progress on any of those four?
So I see some progress. I certainly see that the many decision makers in Europe are aware of the limitations. There are continuing efforts to further integrate the digital single market, to push forward the ambitions around capital markets union. The businesses in Europe are calling for them. Many politicians recognize that we haven't gone far enough. But it's one of those that it's easier to have a big press conference and say that we are putting 40 billion on semiconductors, whereas integrating the digital single market is almost like an accounting exercise. There are so many sort of differences in regulatory systems that need to be really identified one by one. And then there needs to be an effort to really remove those impediments and pursue greater harmonization. So it is not something that is easy to use to get a big sort of political splash announcement that we are really doing this to revitalize the European tech industry. But it's a really important work that needs to be done. And that really lies within the core competence of the European institutions. So that is the one that should be done. I think issues like immigration are harder because we unfortunately are in the state of the world where there's a lot of anti-immigration sentiments around the member states, including very much in the EU. So unfortunately, the case for immigration in today's political climate is harder to make. And I've tried to explain the economic boom that these immigrants can offer to individual EU nations, to the EU as a whole, and really highlight these success stories. But there, I'm probably less optimistic, partially because immigration is done at the member state level, that we could have a big EU-wide push for immigration. I'm not giving up, certainly. I keep bringing it up in all the conversations because I do think that that is absolutely crucial. So the short answer, we're making some progress, but at the same time, not with the speed, with the sense of urgency that ought to be informing any attempts to reform these key pillars of the tech ecosystem.
So Anu, I wanted to ask you about a little bit more about China. How do you see China spreading its model? And are there dangers to that? And what can the transatlantic community do to compete against that?
So I certainly see if I predict the certain degree of the demise, the fall of the American market-driven model, when people around the world are starting to lose their faith in tech companies, self-regulation, I see that the democratic countries are increasingly coalescing behind a variation of the European rights-driven model. But there's a big part of the world, the authoritarian countries, the authoritarian-leaning governments, the developing countries that look to China as a model. And I think there are a couple of reasons why Chinese model is attractive for them. So one being that China is providing them with critical digital infrastructure. That is the exportation of the Chinese digital empire. If the Americans are exporting the private power of the tech companies, the Europeans are exporting the regulatory power, the Chinese are building digital infrastructures along that digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, Africa, Latin America, even parts of Europe. And that is vital for countries like developing countries who say that, look, this infrastructure is good and we can afford it. And the US and the EU often are not providing an alternative. And if we go to those countries and say that, look, if you rely on the Chinese infrastructure, you're going to be beholden to Beijing. You will be surveilled by Beijing. You will not have your privacy. The answer by the developing countries often is, I cannot afford to care about privacy. That is a European luxury concern, and that doesn't make my top 50 concerns when I'm trying to achieve levels of economic development and basic digital services. So I think there China has an advantage. And there's also something else, which really I think is quite uncomfortable for any of us to acknowledge. But China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have managed to create a thriving tech economy without being free. And so it's hard for us to go to the developing countries and say, look, if you follow the Chinese model, all you get is control. You will not see innovation. You will not see economic development. And they look at China and say, well, it seems like I can have both. And they like the Chinese way, the appeal of the idea that they can achieve higher levels of economic development, digital transformation. But at the same time, these countries like the idea that they can have control. They don't want the freedoms. They don't want to maximize privacy. And in that sense, I think there is an uphill battle where the Americans and Europeans really need to come up with a consolidated techno-democratic front, which not is only selling the ideas and the values, but also concretely a path to digital development for these countries. Otherwise, they need to be prepared that these countries will find themselves increasingly as part of the Chinese digital empire.
Finally, Anu, let's talk about the here and now. This year, as you know, is a huge election year around the globe. An enormous number of people are going to be voting. And we have this new AI technology. Are there concerns that you have? And if so, what can we do about them?
So this is my main concern, Karen. So there are many ways we can be sort of unsettled by AI. I focus less right now on the existential risks. I think it's an important conversation, but it's very hard for me to sort of attach probabilities to the likelihood of obliterating humanity. But I don't have a hard time of seeing the probability, the very high probability, almost certainly, that we will have AI already challenge the elections, the integrity of the elections, because AI is potentially amplifying the already existing problems around disinformation. Our relationship to truth will further deteriorate, and our citizens are less able to make informed decisions if they cannot anymore distinguish truth from the fiction. And I think AI can be used in a very powerful way because it can both create content that is fictional. So we have these deep fakes, we can have audio, we can have video, we can have text, that really is difficult for us to distinguish as being a deep fake, being generated by AI. And that can also then work the other way around, is that when we have truthful information about some politicians, those politicians can now dismiss that and say that is a deep fake, that is generated by AI. I never said that. And I think that really puts us all citizens in a very difficult position trying to navigate truth and information that is so critical for democratic conversations. So what could we do? So in many ways, the EU's AI Act is designed to help prevent some of those practices, but it is not even enforceable at this year yet, when we have half the world population going to polls. We have massively important elections, the US presidential elections, the European Parliament, we have India, Mexico, Indonesia. As you said, it's a massively important year for elections. We do have provisions under the European Digital Services Act that impose obligations for platforms to take measures and mitigate so-called systemic risks. And one could be a systemic risk to elections. So when disinformation is carried on their platform. So when you have AI amplified disinformation on those platforms, you should have some comfort may be that the DSA has already forced these companies to be better prepared. And there's a pledge by these companies that, yes, they don't want their tools to be used to undermine democratic elections. But ultimately, we still are short in terms of binding effective measures that would really give us the kind of comfort that we will be safe in running our elections. So this is really a major issue that keeps me awake at night, and something that I hope that we will have better tools going forward. But this is happening awfully fast, and all these societies are not fully prepared to tackle the challenges around AI.
So finally, we ask everyone a question about what books or articles or other kinds of content podcasts you would recommend that they read. Obviously, your book, Digital Empires, is one of them. Is there anything else that you would suggest people who are interested in these issues should take a look at?
So, this was one of the best thing when you write a book, you get to read a lot of great books. But let me suggest one, since we mentioned China. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding how and why China regulates technology the way it does. There's a brand new book by Angela Chang, who is a Hong Kong-based scholar, who really has the unique ability to see China as an insider and outsider, has spent a lot of time in the United States and Europe, but is from mainland China. She has a new book called High Wire that is really showing how China is regulating the big tech and governing its economy. And I think it gives really great insights on and helps you understand what China is trying to achieve, all these pendulum swings that we have seen, the crackdown of the technology, pulling back from that. So maybe I just leave you with Angela's book as the one that I would highlight.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. We really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Karen.
Thank you.